Thank you for joining us for our first SNBAA Black Alumni Town Hall for 2021. My name is Charles Lowry, class of 76, and I'm happy to be a co-moderator with you all this evening. As you know, our Black Alumni Town Hall discussion series is an initiative that aims to inform and facilitate our members around crucial causes and issues that affect the Stanford Black community. The Town Hall allows our members to actively engage with the Stanford leadership community to be better informed about crucial issues and initiatives and inspire collective and impactful action. This evening, we're happy that you have joined us. We hope more and more of you guys will come on board for us tonight. We have an exciting and interesting program for you. We're going to discuss 4 topics of discussion that are very current and relevant to today. The first part is the birth of the Stanford Center for Racial Justice, and in the backdrop of the Black Lives Matter movement and its intellectual framework for addressing racial inequalities. Our second topic will be the impact of structural racism embedded within our criminal justice system, our education system, and our economic system. Our third point that we want to cover is Stanford's response to the deaths of George Floyd and Breonna Taylor and the overall Black Lives Movement. And finally, our fourth topic will be about the overall racial environment on campus. Then when you guys were in school, when I was in school, and what it's like now today. So we have a couple of different aspects of our program tonight that we want to share with you. We're going to have a serious discussion with Professor Ralph Richard Banks. And then in addition to that, we're going to also have some fun time for you to connect with your Stanford classmates and friends. And our Zoom event, it's a Zoom event that will include breakout rooms where you can go and meet and talk to others. Welcome, Professor Banks. Let me just tell you a little bit about him. In addition to being my first cousin, and I'm really happy that 2 Clevelanders are here to talk to you all about Stanford. Professor Ralph Richard Banks is the Jackson Eli Reynolds Professor of Law at Stanford Law School. He's the co-founder and faculty director of the Stanford Center for Racial Justice, which is a big part of why we're here tonight. And he's professor by courtesy at the School of Education. So Professor Banks, I'd like to introduce you. We want to make sure you come on board. But in addition, I have another important person that we want to join us, and that's Mackenzie Tudor. Mackenzie is past co-president of SNBAA, and she's going to be, we're going to be co-hosting this. She's going to be moderating. I'm going to be moderating. We're going to ask lots of questions to Professor Banks, and hopefully have a good and interactive discussion tonight. So I think I'll just get started. Professor Banks. We have to. Hey, how are you, Professor?
I'm doing fine, Charles Ray Lowry, and if you can call me Rick, I can call you Charlie Ray.
Okay, all right. So we'll go with Rick Banks.
I might reveal some of your childhood nicknames because we are.
Oh no, we don't want you to do that. So what I wanted to do, Rick, is just start out and have you tell us how we can start out talking about the Stanford Center for Racial Justice, but I want to talk a little bit about you, about how you got to doing what you're doing now on Stanford. I think people would really be interested in hearing, who you are. Who is Ralph Richard Banks from Cleveland?
Well, I'm a person who actually is amazed to be here with you, amazed to be standing before all of you, because if someone were to roll the clock back, I don't think they would have forecast any of that. Our parents, my parents, my mother and Charles's mother were born in Alabama, came north to Cleveland, fled the terrorism of the Jim Crow era. They had big hopes for their children. And although both of those women are deceased now, I know that they would be overjoyed to see where we are and that we have in fact exceeded their hopes. So our story started in Cleveland, Ohio. And in short, I was able to make it from Cleveland, Ohio to Stanford University as an undergrad, where I knew some of you in the 1980s. Charles came in the 1970s. That was a journey that was possible then. And that journey, frankly, today is not possible. And that's the genesis of the Racial Justice Center. And the genesis of my motivation to have a Racial Justice Center is the recognition that possibilities that existed in the wake of the civil rights era, those possibilities don't exist anymore. And they don't exist anymore in part because of the great inequalities that are growing in our society. I think here about wealth inequality, but also the way that wealth inequality and income inequality entrenches racial inequality. So we have deepening divides in society over the last 50 years. And then when you look at a place like Stanford, you have this extraordinary institution with these great riches, financial riches, but also riches of intellectual capital and social connections. And over that time, these universities have remained or maybe become very, very disconnected from the problems of society in many ways. So the genesis of the Racial Justice Center, at least my motivation for it, is to try to use the university to help solve some of the big problems in society. And when you talk about the big problems and inequalities in society, there's no problem bigger, no problem more enduring, no problem more challenging than the problem of racism. So that's why we're here.
That's right. Well, thank you, Rick, on that point. I just want to also say that, you know, I've known you all my life, and I think that I'm really proud of all your accomplishments and what you've done. And I just wanted you to share with the audience a little bit about like how you met your wife. I think it's such a unique story. And then also the fact that you are the father of 3 African-American young men. And that places you not only in a professional relationship with the center, but as a personal relationship as a father. Could you just tell us your thoughts about that?
You want me to put it all on blast there? Okay. So my wife is Jennifer Eberhardt, and you know, our relationship is another story that we never could have forecast, because we were actually in elementary school together, and we weren't in the same class. We were in different classrooms in the inner city of Cleveland. We used to joke, but it was true, that she was in the class with the rough kids. I was in the class with the kids who were, I guess we were called the nerds at the time, because we were the gifted class. She was the non-gifted class. So let's say it was a little animosity between those classes over time. We did have our lunch money stolen. We did have our kickballs taken at recess. Lots of other things that I preferred not to think about that happened back in elementary school in the inner city. But after that, we parted ways, and I reconnected with Jennifer. And when I was in graduate school, I was in law school, and she was in graduate school at Harvard. And I saw her from across the room at actually a reception for the Black graduate students. I saw her from across the room and recognized her immediately because she looked exactly the same. Whereas, of course, you know, I was bald and so forth and so on. So I don't think she recognized me immediately. But we, you know, resumed our friendship then. And here we are 20 years later, more than 20 years later, 25 years later, even more than 25 years later. We met when we were very young, but 25 years later, she's a professor in the psychology department. One of the, you know, she has a number of initiatives there that she's working on related to race and justice. Part of the vision for the Racial Justice Center, frankly, is to collaborate with Jennifer's program in the psychology department and other programs across the university. But we've been on a long journey. And what, you know, part of what tied us together was that I think we both have always wanted to try to make sense of the racial dynamics in our society. For me, and both of us started in the inner city. I'll just tell you a little. So for me, I went to a private all-boys school for middle school and high school,
Yes.
Which was an extraordinary opportunity. You know, I had classmates there who I looked up to a lot. Gary Malone, who was class of '85, Daniel Coles, who was class of '86, Steve Wirt, who was class of '86. So that was a life-changing experience for me. For Jennifer, after she left elementary school, they actually moved to a suburb, one of the richest suburbs in Cleveland, Beechwood. It was a suburb so rich that when she first told some of my family that she lived in Beechwood, the immediate response was, "You live in Beechwood or you live near Beechwood?"
Right.
Because they didn't imagine Black people living in Beechwood. But she was able to do that because although her father had not graduated high school, as my father had also not graduated high school,
Right.
her father became an antiques dealer. And he did very well as an antiques dealer. In fact, he did so well that they were able to buy this big suburban house. So her path went through a suburban high school. My path went through a private all boys high school. We reconvened when I was in law school, she was in graduate school, and we were both in different ways trying to figure out the racial dynamics of society and try to make sense of our own families' lives, of our friends' lives, to try to understand some of the currents that are operating beneath the surface of society. And we wanted to see, I think even at that time, if there was something we could do to help redirect those currents in some way. Along the way, we were blessed with three boys, wonderful boys, Evie, Everett, and Harlan. Harlan is here with me now. He's our budding filmmaker. So he actually is a pretty serious screenwriter and is working on some projects now that are being considered for production. Our middle son, Everett, is all committed to education. And oldest son, Ebby, is the intellectual and also the historian of the family. So he's the one that I can go to when I'm teaching a class and I don't know the answer to something that happened in 1876 or 1873. He's the one I go to and I can just about always get a reliable answer without having to reveal to my colleagues and others that I didn't know the answer. So we're happy to have all three of them. And we think we have a bit of a family business here in trying to sort out what's going on with our society and how we can move forward. And I'm delighted to have everybody be interested in that project.
Yeah. Well, thank you. Thank you so much, Rick, for sharing that about the family. I think that's important. I'm going to jump right into some, the serious questions. It's been great to talk about family because we love our family and it's really important to both of us, I know. Can you tell us how the Stanford Center for Racial Justice came into being? Can you tell us some of the background around the creation of it and what its theory is to eliminate systemic racism?
Yeah, I think let me tell you what we're kind of the framework for how we think about this work generally, which is that, the big project is to try to undermine racism, which is intertwined. I don't need to tell this audience this, but I want to reiterate it. It's just intertwined with the founding of the nation, right? We have these glorious principles of equality and liberty, but at the time the nation was founded, we had a system of slavery that was the economic underpinning of the entire nation in one way or another. So, the big project is to try to undermine racism. And to do that, we need to understand, well, what has racism done to us? And racism has done two things to us. One thing people talk about a lot and know about, the other thing that racism has done, the other effect of racism is one that's not talked about as much. So the effect of racism that has been most talked about is that racism has produced these enduring disparities between African Americans and others. In short, whatever area of life you look at, education, income, wealth, health, whatever measure of well-being you look at, it's almost always the case that African Americans are on the wrong side of that. So job number one is to try to address those disparities in society that undermine the prospects for people of color generally, but for African Americans in particular. But there's also the second thing that racism does. And this, I think, is really more foundational. The second thing that racism does is that racism has undermined how our society works for everyone. In other words, if it weren't for racism, we would actually have a better system of education for everyone. Part of the reason the educational system, I'm thinking here of primary and secondary education, part of the reason the system doesn't work well is because of the racial politics and dynamics. And to put it quite simply, the feeling of some people that they would rather, they would go without themselves as long as they could deny something to African Americans. So in other words, people have been so invested into denying opportunities for African Americans, they're willing to deny themselves those same opportunities. We've seen this in contemporary society, and we see it historically. This is especially salient during the time of COVID, when it has become so apparent that our social safety net is, frayed is not the right word, it's almost non-existent. And part of the reason it's non-existent is because we have so many people who have been made to invest in their whiteness so much that they are willing to cling to that and to deny African Americans resources and to deny a social safety net to African Americans, even when it means that they don't have the social safety net themselves. So that's a really destructive dynamic that, again, goes all the way back to the founding of our nation and even beyond. That people have been unwilling to do things because they don't want African Americans to benefit, and in denying African Americans those benefits, they also deny those benefits to themselves. So in this sense, racism undermines the system for everyone.
Right.
The important point to see there is that we ultimately, I think, are not going to be able to address the disparities challenge if we don't address the challenge of making the system work well more generally. So we have to address the failures of our systems. That's our educational system, our criminal justice system, our economic system, our healthcare system. If we don't address those general failures of the system, it's going to be practically impossible to address the racial disparities that are produced by those systems. So that's kind of the big idea and the big theory that guides us, is to address disparities on one hand, make the system work well for everyone else. Our hope is that if we can do that vigorously enough and vehemently enough, and if we can explain how racism operates, we can move society beyond this zero-sum game that we seem to be locked into, where you have, white people thinking ultimately that, Black people get something and it has to come at their expense, because that's completely wrong. That's not the case. What we need to do is make society work well so that we can grow the pie, grow the society, create more prosperity for everyone. That's the vision that we're trying to move toward.
Right. Okay. That sounds really interesting. Really, so it's sort of, Rick, sort of looking at it in a different way. So how would the center try to do that? It seems like in my work in this housing and mortgage space, we're always talking about increasing home ownership and dealing with the disparities. So we're only dealing with one part and maybe not the whole issue, right? So how would the center, sort of turn this on its head and look at addressing these failures? That's a heavy lift, right? To look throughout the systems about where we failed miserably everywhere.
It is a heavy lift, and I don't want to be too grandiose about what we can do, but I had an uncle who used to say that he would caution me about not being ambitious, and he would say, if you reach for the stars, you might not make it, but if you do, you at least know you won't come up with a handful of dirt. And that's our view. If we reach for the stars and we don't get there, we're still doing something. So how do we do it concretely? So Racial Justice Center is fledgling, I should say. We're in the process of hiring now. We're just sort of filling staff positions. So it's a fledgling enterprise, but we have had a few projects that I think give a sense of what we're trying to do. The very first project that we had was one in conjunction with the Criminal Justice Center at Stanford Law School, and also the African American Mayors Association. The African American Mayors Association is, as the name implies, a group of Black mayors from around the country. Some, large cities like Houston, Atlanta. Some small cities like I think Mount Holly, South Carolina. Some very small cities in there as well. but they actually wanted some help with some policing issues. So we put together a group of faculty and a group of students who worked together in a research group and did a pretty extensive interviewing with the mayors and with other experts around the country, and came up with some reform proposals. I won't bore you with the details unless people want to get into that, but we looked at potential reforms in a number of different areas. One is school discipline issues, the other is traffic enforcement, a third is mental health, and a fourth is homelessness. So we looked at how police policy might be improved, or how cities might do things better in each of those areas in ways that further public safety. Now, the project was, and the overall recommendation, I'll say the general thrust of the recommendation was to try to think whether we can address those problems and rely less on law enforcement to do it, and think about other sources of social support or other resources that might be mobilized to address some of those issues. That was the general approach. But those are issues where we were, race is salient in all of those issues. And we came at it from a racial lens. After all, we were working with the African American Mayors Association. These were almost all mayors who are head of cities that have largely or predominantly Black populations. But it's also the case that if you can help a city decide or figure out how to better address issues of mental illness in the population, or how to better address issues of homelessness in the population, those are reforms that are going to help people of all races. And they can actually be used to help cities of all demographic profiles. So there is kind of a natural fit between addressing the racial dimensions of the problem and also addressing the problem more generally.
Right. Mackenzie?
Yes, thank you for getting a lot of questions in from people. Thank you guys for submitting questions. Please continue to do so. I think people are interested in knowing kind of the role of the Racial Justice Center kind of like internally at Stanford. Does it have any impact on Stanford, what courses are teaching students on racial justice, any kind of like internal efforts going on there?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I think our approach, frankly, is that we put the university and the law school, we put extraordinary resources into courses for students. For all of us who were there decades ago, I think that we would marvel at the opportunities available for students. We have more overseas opportunities than ever. We have more service opportunities than ever. Mm-hmm. We have opportunities for students to create their own courses. We have more interdisciplinary courses than ever, more interdisciplinary degrees. So we put a lot of energy into that. The project of the Racial Justice Center, I think where we fit into that is what we want to do is to get students to reach beyond the campus. So mm-hmm. we actually want to, just as we want to connect the university to the world beyond the campus, we also want to connect students to the world beyond the campus. So, for example, with the policing project that I mentioned, one of the outcomes of that project is that we will have law students, because these were all law students, we will have law students who are part of that project who are going to confer and be consultants in a sense. They're at least going to present their findings to other cities. Some mm-hmm. cities in the Bay Area, maybe some cities beyond the Bay Area. So they're going to get actual practice going out and confronting very directly the problems of policing, which drew them to the course and maybe even drew mm-hmm. them to Stanford Law School. And that's the sort of educational experience that I think is going to be transformative. Genuinely could be life-changing, because it's frankly getting them out of the books and into the world. And that's the next step that we need to take at Stanford in terms of the education of the undergrads and the grad students across all schools, is to connect them to problems in the world and create opportunities for them to develop their skills in actual work relationships with people who are confronting mm-hmm. Problems.
So based on that, do you guys plan on partnering with kind of the undergrad students or other graduate programs at Stanford more? Yeah.
Yep, exactly. So one of the peculiarities of Stanford, in a sense, is that we don't have a policy school. That's been debated for many years, but there is no school of public policy at Stanford. So the law school is pretty much the closest thing we have to a policy school. So lots of students who are interested in policy issues, many of them are also interested in law school. So unsurprisingly, they kind of gravitate toward the law school. Historically, we haven't provided much of a reception for them. We've made some changes in the last many years that have made the law school more hospitable for graduate students in other departments. So GSE students, graduate school of education students, or business school students, med school, engineering, other graduate departments. The next step in that process is actually to sort of open the law school, if you will, to undergrads, because we have some extraordinary undergrads, and those undergrads might say, hey, wouldn't it be great if I could work on a project to reform policing? Or another project we have is to reform education. So we want to create on-ramps into the law school for undergrads and also partner with all of the departments from which those undergrads come.
Perfect. I think one last question was just, have you guys talked to Professor Claiborne Carson or plan to work at all with the MLK Papers Project on anything?
Yeah, I talked to Clay just maybe last week. We did an event together. I love Clay. Part of the what we want to do, so yes, let me say yes. The Martin Luther King, I'll just speak directly here, and the Martin Luther King Institute at Stanford, the King Papers Project, all of that has actually been underappreciated for years at Stanford. Just to be very direct, it's been underappreciated, undervalued, underpromoted. So that's something that in this next phase, we want to try to correct that, because the presence of the King Papers at Stanford, and Stanford being essentially the sort of the guardian, in a sense, of his legacy. That's something that we should take advantage of more and highlight more, because Martin Luther King perfectly embodies what the Racial Justice Center is committed to, and what I think the university should be committed to, which again is to address racial conflicts and racial division and racial inequality in a way that makes society better for everyone. So I don't know exactly what form that collaboration will take. There are a lot of moving pieces there. I'm not the decision maker in terms of some of these issues, but I very much hope that we can have a good collaboration going forward that has at the core of it a value that I think we share, or a recognition that I think we share, which is that the problem of racism is really the problem of democracy. That's, if you just remember one thing, remember that, and we can't make our democracy work unless we address racism. And that's what Martin King believed deep in his heart, and that's what we believe. Yeah.
That's great. You. Charles, do you want to go for it? Yeah.
Yeah, thank you, Mackenzie. We're going to keep going. We have there's 90 minutes are ticking away, and Rick, you've been so informative. It's been great to talk to you about that. Our second topic, all of this kind of flows together, but the impact of structural racism embedded within our criminal justice system, our education system, our economic system. How do you effectively implement new policies and systems to dismantle systemic racism in a social system in which those in power benefit from the status quo? What is the incentive to implement changes to the racial hierarchy for those at the top of the hierarchy? So how do we take what you've talked about and really make it work with everyone?
Yeah, so let me give you some high level thoughts, and then I'll go to another of our concrete current projects. The big picture there is that we do need to convince people that everyone in our society, frankly, has an interest in our overcoming racism. And everyone has that interest because, to make it really plain, this democracy is not something we can take for granted. It's not clear that we're going to have it 30, 40, 50 years from now, even 10, 20 years from now, if we don't care for it. And if we don't address racism, our democracy will be in peril. And if we lose that, we lose it for everybody. This is equivalent to, when you're a kid and you're playing a game, and if at some point the game just breaks down, everybody has to go home. It's not that you just have some people who've lost the game, it's that everyone has to go home. So if we want to keep this game going, we need to all pitch in to try to make society work. And when I say all, that doesn't only mean people of all races, that means all the different institutions. We can't leave it to government. We need government, but we also need nonprofits. We also need for-profits. Businesses have a role to play here as well. So we all need to pitch in, and we need to deepen our understanding of the ways that racism has undermined well-being for all of us. So that's the motivational part.
Great.
The second step there, which is also a hard part, is to get people to see how that happens concretely. Because there's so many things that we take for granted in society that in fact are unjust and unfair and leave us all worse off. But we've been doing them so long that sometimes we don't see the problems where they are. So one of those problems is in the field of education. So big problem with education is that we have developed an educational system from elementary school on through universities that allows, in a sense, the rich to get richer. We have an educational system that enables the rich to get richer and then justifies it by saying, oh, well, those are the people who were smarter, those were the people who have worked harder, that's why they have more, and those other people have less. And that's wrong in so many ways. So one of the aims of the Racial Justice Center is to try to democratize education. And there are many different settings where this can occur. We started by focusing on primary and secondary education. So I mentioned earlier how we had this research group of law students and faculty, and we worked on these policing issues. Well, this quarter that just ended, just a few days ago, in fact, we had a research group that was comprised of law school faculty, law school students, graduate school of education faculty, and some graduate school of education students. So this is an interdisciplinary group, and we came together to actually support an effort working with outside partners to democratize education in New York City. The outside partner in New York City is a grassroots community group called Integrate NYC, which, as the name implies, they want to integrate education within New York City by race and class. And there was another outside partner, which is the largest public interest law firm in the country, Public Counsel. So this effort has resulted in a lawsuit that I can talk about because it was recently filed. This time last week, I couldn't talk about it because it had not been filed. But it was filed in the courts in New York, naming the city and the state as defendants and identifying a whole slew of ways in which the educational opportunities in New York City are stratified on the basis of race and class and work to the disadvantages of people who look like us. And this is covered, you might have seen it, it's been covered in the New York Times and many other media, but this is kind of the tip of the iceberg or the first step lawsuit. This is not the end of the battle, it's the beginning of the battle. But the goal there is to break down these illicit, unjustifiable hierarchies that ration access so that the Black people lose out again and again and again. Meanwhile, people are telling you that that's justifiable because they didn't have what it takes. And we're here to say that that's not true, and we need to challenge people in those assumptions. Our hope is that once you can lay bare the facts and really make clear to people what's going on, people will look at these systems and see that what's happening is so inequitable that even if we have previously thought of ourselves as winners, we don't want to be a part of that system.
That's great. Again, it's a unique. Was New York City chosen for a particular reason, Rick? What was the case around that?
If the question is why was education chosen? Well, we have three different areas that we're working in now. I mean, this may change over time and will expand and reconfigure. But the three areas that we're focusing on now are policing and public safety. That's one. Educational opportunity is the other. And then the third is economic security and opportunity. And those are three areas that we think are just at the foundation of so much that's wrong with society. And those are three areas where racism has really done its work to undermine well-being for African Americans in particular, but also for people of other races.
Right. Okay, that's gives us some good examples of the work that the fledgling center is going to undertake. Mackenzie, do you have any live questions from our audience that we can share with Professor?
I think, on the topic of institutional and structural racism, I think there's a lot of questions coming up about reparations and kind of, in addition to fixing these like institutional systematic failures, people think we should be talking about reparations as well. So they kind of want to know your opinion on it, the political viability of it, and kind of if, I think more of it's a possibility or how we could address it.
Yeah, so if I were to receive a check, I would cash it. But I would cash it, but frankly, I don't believe that will happen. I mean, politically, I don't believe that will happen. I don't think the United States is going to pay reparations to African Americans. But I do think the conversation about reparations and raising the issue of reparations is an important thing to do, because what it does is it promotes a reflection on the part of people of all races about, frankly, what's really been going on in the nation. Because the motivations to imagine that bad stuff happened back then and now we're doing all the good stuff and we're not doing any bad stuff, that's such a powerful motivation. There's so many powerful motivations to see things in that way. But the moment you start to talk about reparations and you start to talk about what happened in the past and you start to link what happened in the past to what happens now and the disparities that exist, I think that that's the sort of conversation that we need to have, because that can result in a shift in consciousness so that people can see the inequalities in the society in a different way. And if they can see those inequalities in a different way, they might be more motivated to remedy them.
No, that definitely makes sense. This kind of goes back to our first topic a little bit, but I think a lot of alumni and on the call kind of just want to know, how can alumni best support your work? How can they get involved? How would you like us to engage in it?
Well, that's a wonderful question to hear. And I should emphasize that there is a role for all of us. One of the points that we want to emphasize to Stanford students, law students, and others, is that this effort to make our society and our democracy a better democracy and a more racially equitable society, those are challenges that everyone can play a role in, no matter what they do or where they end up. So you can be a civil rights lawyer and you play a role in that. You can be a corporate lawyer and you can play a role in that. You can be a computer scientist and you play a role in that. So that's important to know, is that this is not a job that we can leave to someone else. In terms of what people individually can do, it depends on who you are and where you are. To start with, we're all in some way or another part of organizations. Employers, nonprofits, civic organizations. For every organization we're part of, we can always ask, well, what can our organization do? Just raising the question and prompting that conversation can sometimes cause people to rethink how their organization operates. And then they might rethink how their organization operates internally, in terms of who they hire and the inclusiveness of their environment. And those are important conversations. That could be a whole nother session. But they should also think about how their organization relates to entities beyond their organization. That is, what's the impact that the organization is having on the world? So if you're a company, you can ask, well, who are your subcontractors? Who are the people you bring in as clients? Who are the people that you engage in work? All of those are places where we should think about whether what we're doing is fair and equitable, and whether we could do more. So those are things that people can think about, and then they should ask themselves the question, what can I do in these different roles? Now, let me just say a little bit more specifically to Stanford graduates, to Stanford alums, because you might wonder, like, what can I do as a Stanford person, right? As someone who went to Stanford and has this tie to the institution. And I guess I would say there that, it starts by recognizing that you can have an impact on the institution. The great value of a place like Stanford, to be really blunt about it, it's not the students, it's not the buildings, it's not even the faculty. The greatest asset of the university is the alumni base. It's all of these many tens of thousands of people who graduated over many decades, who have some link to this institution. All of those people have networks, they have influence, they have concerns that they can bring to the institution and that they can use to help the institution do better. So be aware that you probably have more power, more influence than you realize in shaping the future of the institution and how the institution engages with the world. Now, to make it even more concrete, if you want to talk about these issues or run ideas past someone, I'm always available at rbanks.stanford.edu. I'm happy to do some traffic direction on incoming inquiries. If people have ideas along the lines of, I wonder if Stanford wants to be involved with this, or I wonder if Stanford could benefit from that, or I wonder if I could connect Stanford to these people, right? All of those sorts of inquiries are all fair game, and I'm more than happy to help facilitate all those connections.
Yes. I feel like you also have those periodic race talks with different guests that are really great for alumni to attend.
Yep. That's true.
We will, go ahead.
No, go ahead, Mackenzie, go ahead.
I was saying we can circulate the information later about Professor Banks. He does these talks, I think, every other month with a different guest about a racial issue, which are really great.
Yeah, that's great to hear.
Oh, thank you.
Yeah.
I'll give a shout out. So we're our fledgling organization, so we're just sort of stepping up programs one by one. But this Tuesday Race Talk series is something we're excited about. I just had a conversation a couple of weeks ago with another Black alum, Steve Phillips, who was class of '76, also from Cleveland.
All right.
And we had a wonderful conversation about democratic politics. And let me just give you one tidbit from that, which I thought was important. He talked about an email that he got in 2010, from 2011, somewhere in that. And the email said, there's a lot of work to do. And a lot of people don't think we can get there, but I think we can do it. This is in 2010, 2011. The email was from Stacey Abrams, who was talking about Georgia.
Wow.
No kidding.
That's crazy.
That was a vision there when most people didn't see it, didn't think it was possible. And she had no money to do it, no organization to do it. But she saw how it could happen. So
and she did it,
one example of how you can make things happen. You dedicate yourself, you stick with it, and bring in those you need to go along with you.
That's great. Well, we're going to keep on track here. We're going to go to our next topic, Professor Banks. You mentioned in the beginning, you felt some concern about Stanford as an institution and it being sort of disconnected. And I wanted to ask you, what did you see being on campus in terms of Stanford's response to the deaths of George Floyd and Breonna Taylor and the overall Black Lives Movement?
Yeah.
What do you see going on campus with regard to that, and in a leadership way or in an impact way?
Yeah, I think Stanford. So there have been many, highly publicized instances of police violence against African Americans in particular. And Black Lives Matter was a big issue on campus. We had a lot of protests back in 2015, 2016 at the law school and elsewhere on campus. And those protests confronted a university that frankly has not been known for being a place of racial justice or social justice. I'll just speak frankly, is that Stanford has been known as, and the brand of Stanford is a place of technological supremacy and technological wizardry. We are the place that graduates the people who start the Silicon Valley companies that make the new apps or the search engines, but we're not known as a place that has doubled down on racial justice or even social justice. So one of the consequences, I think, of this whole run, this whole string of events culminating in the killing of George Floyd is that Stanford has reflected, the leadership has reflected on our place and has come to the conclusion that perhaps we need to put a stake in the ground around racial justice. And that perhaps we should recognize institutionally that issues of race are bound up with issues of democracy, and that racism might be the single most monumental challenge confronting our democracy. So people have recognized that, and it's taken a long time to do so. The question that lingers, though, is what's going to happen once we move beyond this period that we're in now. The anniversary of the killing of George Floyd will be upon us in May. We'll be coming out of the pandemic by next fall. If one were to look back in the history of our nation, one would see many examples where the nation or particular institutions became committed to addressing issues of racial injustice, but then time passed and eventually they moved on. So the question that remains for all of us, for Stanford and for the society, is whether this time the issue will have some staying power and whether this time our commitment will be steadfast or whether we will eventually move on as our nation has done in the past.
One of the things I saw in the chat, that's great information, Rick, on maybe where the institution is. On campus, there's the Hoover Institution, there's other sort of conservative places for research and think tanks. One question that came up in the chat was, will the Stanford Center for Racial Justice also have a think tank component to it? Like you've talked about the focus of the center, how to address not only the inequalities, but the systematic problems that affect everyone. But will there be is there room for that sort of building of a think tank sort of situation for the center?
Yes, I think we, so again, some of these decisions are above my pay grade, so to speak. Some of these decisions, frankly, depend on the action of alums and people who have influence outside of the university. So, but I but my big hope, if I'm gonna have a big dream here, I would hope that we would recognize as a university and also as a society that the racial challenges that confront us and the challenges for democracy, these are not ultimately challenges related to partisan politics or political ideology. Ultimately, they are hard problems. They're hard problems that require intellectual capital and the research capabilities of a great university if we are to address them. So if you understand the problems we confront as these hard problems that require intellectual capital and research capabilities, one way to respond to that would be to create some sort of structure on campus that is, and I'm hesitant to say a think tank, because it needs to be a think tank and a do tank. Right? That's the shift we need to make. We don't just want people thinking about stuff. We want to be able to produce knowledge in partnership with communities, engage with people outside of the bounds of the campus, so that we can then use that knowledge and use that research to help to transform society. So, so a think tank is fine as long as we attach that to a do tank as well.
Right.
But the thinking has to operate along with the action. And the work that happens inside of the university has to operate in conjunction with people who are outside of the university struggling with problems.
Right. I think a follow-up that I have to that, Rick, is, okay, we talk about a think tank and a do tank, and that's really great and so important. What about Stanford's role amongst elite universities? Do you see the center? In fact, are there has anything been developed like this at other institutions in like the Stanford Center? Do you have some groups that are?
Yeah.
Go ahead. Yeah.
No, those are great issues. If I'm catching correctly, there are many other universities that have had the same realization that Stanford has had in the last year, and that's a good thing. The next or a subsequent phase of all of our work will be actually to have an unprecedented level of cooperation and coordination and collaboration, rather than competition. Historically, major universities have competed with each other. Stanford competes with Harvard, competes with Yale, competes with Princeton, and so forth. What we need to do is to actually work together to try to help solve some of society's problems. And I know people who are heading our similar initiatives at Harvard and at Yale and at NYU and at Columbia. And there have been some conversations about working together, but we need to build up our own structure before we do that. But that's maybe the end game here. And the best example of that, of what can happen when you work together, I think, is the fact that now we're all in a society where we have vaccines available. When I was talking to a friend at the very beginning, who's a PhD and an MD, and knows medicine, I was talking to him about the prospects for vaccine development, and he said he didn't think it could happen in less than a year. He thought maybe the best we could do was a year and a half. Typically, vaccines took longer than that, he told me.
Right.
And we obviously did better than that. But the reason we did better than that was because the urgency of the situation prompted people to cooperate across institutional boundaries in ways they never had before.
Right.
What we need to recognize is that our democracy is also in crisis. And racism is at the heart of that crisis. Some people might have doubted that, years ago, but it's hard to see how people can really doubt that now. We're in crisis, and racism is at the heart of that crisis. And we need the same sort of collaboration and cooperation that we saw on display in the hunt for the vaccine.
Yeah, speaking, you just mentioned our democracy. I think there were a lot of questions about if the center is going to be doing any work on, voter suppression, voter rights, and everything that's going around the country on that right now.
So the issue of politics and political participation, that's actually underlying all of the problems that I've discussed, frankly. The educational issues, the economic issues, the public safety issues. Our political system needs to work better.
Yeah.
One of the things that we want to do, and I'm in favor of more people voting rather than fewer, right? Mm-hmm. We're not working directly on that issue, but I'm in favor of more people voting rather than fewer. I think we need to, as a society, we need to recognize that democracy works better when everybody is invited to play, and when everyone is invited to participate. But let me highlight one particular way that political participation figures into our projects. A lot of times when you talk to people in universities, when you talk to researchers, professors, we kind of think that, we're going to figure out the problem and we're going to write about it in a law journal or in a medical journal or in a psychology journal, and that's going to be our contribution. But now we know that that's not enough. So the model that we want to promote and exemplify is a model of democratizing knowledge and democratizing information so that ordinary people are armed with the tools that they need to make their lives work better. So, quick example, on the policing front, there was, many of you probably saw the movie When They See Us about the Central Park Five, which showed these horrible things that cops can do to elicit false confessions from people.
Yeah.
There was justifiably a lot of outrage in response to that movie. People wanted to do something. And they did stuff, but it was all kind of like, revenge and getting back at the people who were involved in that particular incident. But as it turns out, the same policies that were in place in New York City at that time, they are in place in thousands of police departments around this country. But people didn't know that. They didn't have a way to know what the policies were at their police department. And they didn't even know what policies they should advocate for at their police department. So one example of how we want to democratize research and democratize knowledge would be to create user-friendly, very accessible databases where, say, if you live in Indianapolis, you can click on Indianapolis and say, for example, you can see what the use of force policies are in Indianapolis or what the policies are about interrogation of suspects in Indianapolis. And then you can also see what better policies would look like. You can arm citizens with that information, something that is really almost a to-do list of take this policy and go to your city council and tell them at the meeting you want the police to adopt this policy. If we can get thousands or even millions of people doing that, that's how you produce change politically, right? It's not simply through, doing the research and getting it on CNN or in the New York Times. It's giving ordinary people information they need so that they can go to their school board, to their county commissioner, to their mayor's office or their city council or their state legislature, and they can say, we don't want this. We know that there's something else that's better. The research has told us so. That's the model of change that we're trying to push ultimately.
Well, and hopefully you can leverage Stanford's technology resources to build this out, since it's what
you do. A lot of resources. So back to that question about what people can do, donations are always accepted. And donations are always accepted.
Right.
There is a very popular question about critical race studies. It says, we've heard about an effort to muzzle the teaching of critical race studies in a memo that actually said raising claims of issues of racism at Stanford would be considered out of bounds.
Yep.
So essentially, I think people want to know more about that situation if you know anything.
Yeah, so again, as with most things, if you talk about critical race theory or critical race studies, there are desirable variants of it, and there are undesirable variants of it, right? Now, the desirable variant and the important message of critical race studies generally is that it counters what we might describe as a pervasive liberal narrative in American society. And this narrative in American society is that, we used to have a problem with race. That was back in the bad old days, but we got rid of slavery, and then we had the civil rights laws, and now everything is good. And so let's move on, right? That's kind of a conventional narrative of progress. Critical race studies or critical race theory counters that narrative and says, not so fast. In fact, we are still living with the effects of racism because racism in the past and today continues to shape American institutions and policies and practices. And that, I think, is unquestionably correct, right? I mean, our project starts from that assumption, or from that premise, that race continues to distort the functioning of our democracy. So that's an important insight that many people still don't want to hear. but we need to do the research, and we need to talk about it and try to get people to understand and to see how that is so. So that's all the benefit of critical race theory. But there are also bad expressions of critical race theory. And, sometimes you do hear about, training programs or diversity programs that, want white people to admit that they're guilty and to kind of, own up to their racism, and that want to cast, all white people as villains. And I think that's a bad expression of critical race theory, not only because it's not politically astute, but substantively, it misframes the issues, because the ultimate challenge that we have in our society is not really, between white and blacks. It's really the seductive value or the seductive effect of the idea of race, which is itself an expression of racism. Let me repeat that. The problem we have is not white people, despite what some of my other cousins might say. That's not the problem. The problem that we have is that racism has seduced us, and it has seduced us from the very beginning of this nation. The first step in that seduction, of course, is to make us think that there is such a thing as races, which there are not biologically, but it makes us think there's such a thing as races, and that some races are better than others. And then there's a lot that flows from that. So that's what we need to confront. And white people are genuinely a victim of the seductiveness of race. They're not, most white people are not the creators of that. They're a victim of that. So we need to understand the common humanity that we all share, and that we're all struggling in a system that is not of our making, and that also has ceased to work well for most of us.
Yeah, absolutely. I think there's one last question in this kind of topic about if there's a narrative going on right now that policies have gone too far and that we're now trying to make certain minority groups better than white people instead of fighting for equality. So I guess they want to address how you combat that narrative, and if you've experienced people saying that narrative.
Okay, Mackenzie, I think I might have missed some of that question, but I think the issue is that should we, how do we think about treating everyone equally as opposed to trying to do better by minority groups?
Yeah, essentially there's a group of people that say which basically Black people or minorities are trying to be above white people instead of just fighting for equality.
Oh, wow. Well, what we need to understand. So if the worry is that, there's a long-standing worry in our society that whenever we start to talk about addressing racism, people say, oh, you're doing something special for the Black people. And one of the things I do when I'm teaching the 14th Amendment this spring, class starts soon. And in the first day or two of that class, I go back to 1866, just after the Civil War ended. And at that time, people wanted to have, what we might now think of as sort of affirmative measures to help the freed slaves. I mean, after all, they had been enslaved.
Mm-hmm.
They passed the Civil Rights Act in 1866. That Civil Rights Act purported to give Black people the same rights as white people, nothing more. Yet Andrew Johnson, who became president after Lincoln died, Andrew Johnson vetoed the Civil Rights Act. And his position was that we're doing more for Black people than we're doing for white people. We're making them the special favorites of the laws. He said memorably that to think that we need to keep doing stuff for Black people, and I'm paraphrasing now, would be running the slavery argument into the ground. That was the idea at that time. Yeah. And, this was after the end of slavery, a year after. So we see that, this idea of somehow we're doing too much for African Americans, that has a long lineage. And I think that the contemporary response to that needs to be to try to show people, get people to understand the depth and the pervasiveness of the inequalities in our society, which cut along lines of race. And I'd say that that's a research project, that's a public education project that is sorely needed, because most people don't realize, for example, that here we are half a century after the civil rights movement, and the average white family still has 10 times as much wealth as the average Black family. And that those racial disparities in wealth persist, even if you look at people who have similar educational levels. So people who graduated high school or college, or even people who graduated from Stanford.
Yeah.
If you look 10 years out or 20 years out, you see enormous disparities in wealth and also in well-being by some measures. So we need to get people to understand that the racial problems really are still with us. And sometimes the only way you can further equality is to treat people differently based on their circumstances and their situations and the history that has landed them where they are.
Yeah,
Great.
absolutely. I'll let Charles go forward.
Okay, all right. Thank you, Mackenzie. Professor Banks, we're just about to wrap up. We got a few more minutes, maybe 20 minutes. I'm in the last part of our four-part questions or program that we wanted to discuss. Our topics was the overall racial environment on campus now versus in the past. I think you've addressed some of that. So what have you've talked about how people maybe wouldn't recognize how things are on campus, what the opportunities are. Do you think that for the students, for faculty, for yourself being there for some time, and Jennifer, what has been the change that you've seen? Is it a good change? Is it in need of adjustment? What would you think?
That's a tough one. Well, let me start by just saying that Stanford students now, they have opportunities that would have been unimaginable decades ago. So life is really good for them generally. That said, there is a lot of discontent, polarization, and division on campus. And sometimes, frankly, we do things, the faculty and the administration, we do things that reinforce that. We sometimes are too worried about pleasing students to be really direct, and we're not adamant enough or committed enough to the cause of educating students and developing students. And just as with your children, sometimes pleasing them is antithetical to teaching them and developing them. And we could do a bit better on the educating and developing side, even though that would generate clashes with students in some pretty high profile areas. So that's my view. I should say from the faculty side, from what I see, is one of the biggest challenges we have now is that we see the same division that you have outside of campus coming onto the campus, so that people are calling each other out, and people are criticizing others who are on the other side politically. And I think that all that is actually antithetical to what a university should be. We have to be a place where we value intellectual inquiry and solving problems above all. We have to be a place where we welcome different viewpoints. We have to be a place where we can disagree with the view without vilifying the person. And that's not always the place that we are, frankly. But that's what we need to be, because we need to exemplify those intellectual and academic values as a counterweight to a social media world and a cable news world and a political world where everyone is trying to vilify the person they don't agree with.
Right. I know Evie, Harlan, Everett, and as a father, again, as 3 African-American boys, I want you to just tell us, what do you want for them, and what do you see this center as to doing? what are your hopes? You mentioned a think tank and a do tank, but where do you want their lives to be, and how can this center really help them?
Where do I want their lives to be? Oh my, Whew, that's a big one. I guess what I want. I think I do want the. I mean, now I'm old enough, still young, but old enough that I can start to see some of the law students and certainly some of the undergrads as my own children, right? Because the undergrads in particular, they are the age of my children.
Right.
And I want the same things for the students that I think I want for my children, which is to try to be able to equip them with the resources and the guidance that they need to be whoever it is they want to be in this world. Right? So it's not about directing them to do X. It's about creating a platform or creating opportunities where they can decide what it is they want to do. And if you have 3 boys, say, hypothetically, and one of them wants to be a history professor, and one of them wants to go into business, and one of them wants to go to Hollywood, that's all fine. As long as they don't forget their mom and dad. You always need a spare room for mom and dad.
Right.
But that's the only thing I insist on.
Mackenzie, any follow-up or closing questions that you have from the audience?
Yeah, definitely. I think one thing the audience is really interested in knowing is, how is Stanford actively training staff and faculty to be anti-racist? And if there's not a current plan, what needs to be done to elevate this as a priority?
Okay, so Mackenzie, if I don't hit this on all parts of this, come back at me. But the Stanford, the university is also in the midst of George Floyd and other stuff, right? The university is in the midst of reevaluating itself, because I think that the institution, frankly, had fallen prey in some respects to the same very comforting myth that American society has fallen prey to, which is that we had racial problems back in the day. We've addressed those. Now we can't move on. Everything is cool. And recently, people have felt emboldened to say, well, no, everything is not okay. There are some issues here. There are some problems here. So one of the things that the university is thinking about, and there's a lot of soul searching going on about this, is how to make the university itself and its internal operations, how to make it a place where everyone can feel included, to feel that they belong, to feel that they're valued. And that's a big challenge, which I hope we will solve. It's also a challenge, going back to my earlier remarks, that I don't think we can solve unless we also think very foundationally about how the university operates and what the culture of the university is. So in other words, if we want to make Stanford work well for Black staff, say, we need to think about ways that Stanford is not working well generally, and we need to correct those. We need a culture shift, an institutional transformation to some extent. And the upside of that is that Stanford will not only work well for the Black staff, it'll work better for staff of all races. So hopefully that's a project that everyone can get behind. I don't know yet how we're going to get there, or even if we will get there, but I am hopeful that we will.
Yes, and I'm sure we will be, we are talking to the president of Stanford in our next Black Town Hall, and I'm sure that will be a big topic of conversation for us. So I'm sure we'll have to talk more about what they're actually doing in terms of changing the culture at Stanford.
Yeah, and I will say, I mean, I have 2 hats here because I'm an alum, but then I'm also part of the institution now.
Yeah.
But I would just encourage everyone to not be hesitant to ask hard questions. A lot of times we talk in terms of diversity, and we're all committed to diversity, we know, but sometimes you can ask very simple questions like, what is the percentage of Black staff, right, within these departments? Or what is the percentage of African American students within the law school or the business school or the med school or postdocs or faculty, right? I mean, we need to be transparent about all of that information And if people don't have that information, it's hard to know how to respond.
Mm-hmm. Perfect. I think, yeah, I think that's absolutely true. There's just a couple more last questions I was hoping to get to. I think there was one kind of quick question about so if there is going to be a Department of African American Studies, would you prefer the Racial Justice Center to be located there or in the law school?
No. I think what we need to do is, so I think this has been announced, right? African American Studies, which has been a program for its entire duration, will become a department. So that's something that's been pushed for many years now. Mm-hmm. So the Center for Racial Justice, ideally, is not something that's confined to the law school. So we don't, right now, we're based in the law school, but we think of ourselves as serving the entire university. Mm-hmm. So we're based in the law school, but we want to serve the entire university. What we don't want to happen is to have any kind of racial justice initiative be isolated or limited to one particular school or department. Because in fact, the entire university should be engaged with issues of race and equity. Mm-hmm. And sometimes if you put it in one place and say, oh, that's their program, then other people feel like, okay, not my job, somebody else has got that covered. Yeah. But in fact, our message needs to be that, no, this is a job that we all have to apply ourselves to. So we do not want the Racial Justice Center to be limited to the law school. It's fine for it to be based in the law school, but frankly, it doesn't even have to be based in the law school. The key point, though, is that the reach of any racial justice initiative at Stanford needs to be university-wide, mm-hmm. from the med school to the ed school and everything in between. Because racial problems and the effects of racism doesn't come prepackaged as a legal problem or as a sociological problem or as a historical problem. It comes packaged in ways that require us to apply skills from many different disciplines and perspectives. So this is one place where everybody needs to be on board and ready to work because we're all needed to play some role.
Absolutely. Yeah, I think that's definitely right. And it'd be great to see the collaborations across the whole university as it goes forward. Okay, last question I think we're going to take before Charles closes it for us. There's often a critique of academic institutions that they are, perpetuating elitism and inaccessible. So I think, how are you centering the work on the most impacted people, and kind of what's your role within the community?
Yep, that's well, and I actually agree with that critique, and I'm writing a book, full disclosure, about that critique. So it actually is a problem that this goes back to what I started with, that we have these growing problems in society, mm-hmm. which is that we have a very small group of winners, and we have a society that's not working well for the bulk of its people and the overwhelming majority of the Black people. So, and then we have institutions like Stanford that frankly are richer and more influential than they have ever been. Mm-hmm. Maybe even richer and more influential than any educational institution in the history of the world.
Yeah.
Yet these institutions educate the children of the most privileged people in the world. Now, simply to state that as what's happening should refute that as a desirable state of affairs. Stanford, along with other institutions, needs to be in the business of democratizing education. That means to educate as many people as we can and as much as we can, and try to promote well-being across the nation and around the world to the greatest extent that we can. Mm-hmm. Now, there's a lot of discussion about what exactly does that mean, but we know it doesn't mean educating the most privileged people in the world almost exclusively. And that is mostly what the university does. Don't be deceived. So we need to do better with that. Let me just give you one small way. So, and I have again a number of projects related to my book that I'm looking into about what we can do. But one thing we're doing right now is part of a collaboration, and the Racial Justice Center is part of a collaboration with other faculty at Stanford, where we are working with the state of Alabama. This is the state of Alabama that my mother and Charles's mother came from. And we're working with the governor there to try to reinvigorate Alabama. It's called, I believe, the Alabama Innovation Initiative. And we have a number of Stanford faculty assembled to provide advice to the state about how they can reinvigorate their economy, their educational system, and to do so equitably. And one of the things we're going to do is we're going to partner with universities in Alabama.
Mm-hmm.
But we're not only going to partner with the flagship schools in Alabama, we're going to partner with HBCUs in Alabama. So you have Stanford students working together with students from Alabama universities, including the HBCUs, to try to solve problems in Alabama. This is a small measure, but this is just one way where, we can reach out beyond Silicon Valley, beyond Stanford. We can connect to another part of the country. We can connect to other universities. We can connect our students to students that they might never meet otherwise, and have them working together in teams to try to bolster the economy and improve well-being in the state that my family hails from. So I'm very excited about that. And that project will be starting, the research lab with that project will be starting this spring.
Very cool. Great. And I know you mentioned you had a book. You're working on a book. There was another question if you're doing a follow-up book to Marriage for White People, but I don't know if you want to just mention if you have any books that you're working on or coming out soon.
Well, the book that I'm promoting the book that I'm working on is called The Miseducation of America, which is about how we've allowed education to become, in short, kind of a rich get richer system. It is a rich get richer system from the elementary schools up through the university level, and that is really antithetical to what education should be. So that is my project. The book that I'm promoting right now is a book called Bias by Jennifer Eberhardt.
Of course.
If you haven't read it, you should read it. Full disclosure, that is my wife. But it's an extraordinary. It's very readable, very accessible, and connects the reader to the most cutting-edge psychological research, which gives a sense of how race is working in all of our minds, even at times when we don't realize it, right? So that's the book that if you don't have it, you should get it. And if you know somebody that doesn't have it, you should buy it for them.
Buy it for them. Yeah, that's a good idea.
Absolutely. Charles, do you want to close us or?
Yeah, thank you. Thank you, Mackenzie. Thank you for that. Rick, we're like at 6:26. We've talked for an hour and 26 minutes, and we only have a few minutes left. Do you have anything you'd like to tell, the SNBAA people that have joined us tonight? Any closing remarks that you'd like to share with us?
Well, I would, let me just say how, honored I am to be here. I'm pleased to be with you all. I am impressed and inspired that everyone has been able to assemble this. So in addition to Charles and Mackenzie, I know Anthony Franklin has done yeoman's work here, as my father would have said. So has Chris Gourier, has done extraordinary work to put this event and other events together. And we were in school together. So thank you all for doing this. Don't forget, though, as you go on about your lives, that some words of one of my sons. I don't even know which one it was. They wrote on our board at home something that seems appropriate now, and this is from some African proverb. If you want to go fast, go alone. But if you want to go far, you must go together. And that's, I think, appropriate here to keep in mind. If you go alone, you can go fast. But if you want to go far, you must go together.
Right. Because
there is strength in joining forces and finding the synergy of your relationships and bolstering each other in what you want to bring about that you simply can't recreate if you're on your own. So my big hope and vision for the Black Alumni Association is that, we can continue and even can build on this togetherness and collaboration that you've already created to accomplish dreams that none of us would have been able to accomplish alone, and that we might not even have been able to envision alone. So thank you again.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Professor Banks. And thank everyone for joining us this evening. We're really, we want to thank everyone for your participation. We hope that we've learned a lot from our event. I know I did, and learned a lot from Professor Banks. And I think the center is in good hands with him in the leadership role that he has. We thank you for tuning into this. Mackenzie, thank you for being an excellent. I think we had a good tag team, and
Yes.
we want to thank Professor Banks for all the things. It's nice to see my cousin in this professional capacity. But please remember to join the next event. And Mackenzie, you said that's coming up on June 2nd, right, with the president?
Yes, I believe that's the date. It's coming up in June, and that will be the next Black Town Hall. And stay involved and connected to SNBAA. And thanks again for everything.